Good afternoon, everybody. This is a live recap of what happened last night with Hurricane Otis that intensified into a Category 5 hurricane. Central pressure dropped over 77 millibars in less than 24 hours, going from a Category 1 hurricane to a Category 5 hurricane in a 9-hour period. And a lot of the official National Weather Service forecast really showed it to recurve and basically stay below a tropical storm, even kind of doing a little bit of a loop just to the west side of the Mexican high, which was right over Mexico. There was a little bit of wind shear being indicated, but if you take a little bit of a deeper look, you can see that some of those models didn't have a very accurate depiction of what was going to happen. There was a large reservoir of very warm water just to the north of it. But we're going to break down the latest out of Acapulco that was hit by that Category 5. There was definitely some offshore flow over most of Acapulco proper until the eye passed by, and then you got a little bit of storm surge into the bay. But out near the airport and also just a little bit south of the airport, a lot of that onshore flow on the north side of the hurricane came in unimpeded off the ocean. And I think that likely devastating storm surge was found down near the airport and a little bit to the south of Acapulco. Obviously, a lot of devastation in Acapulco proper, too. Looking at some of the videos, you could definitely tell that there's a big difference between an offshore flow coming off that mountainous terrain versus the flow just ripping right off the water, almost frictionless. I suspect that out near the airport and a little bit south of there, some of that unimpeded flow right off the water possibly could have even reached 200 miles per hour in gusts. And the airport, International Airport down south of Acapulco, is still closed due to damage. I haven't seen any photos out in that area. And off to the south of the bay, south of Acapulco, the terrain is a little bit different, and I'm going to be going over that as well. All right, got that sent out. So now we're about to get started here. I've got the whole thing mapped up, including what I would have done if I was storm chasing, covering this storm. There you can see a satellite image of the storm right when the eye was over Acapulco proper. And early this morning, right after the eye went right past Acapulco, is when you got the southerly flow. And of course, up here in the northern hemisphere, everything goes around counterclockwise. So initially, when the hurricane was approaching from the southeast at peak intensity, you largely had offshore flow over Acapulco, and the strongest portion of that eye wall, the front eye wall, began to arrive. And once it started interacting with the mountainous terrain over in Mexico, the eye began to fill in pretty rapidly, but it really reached peak intensity on approach to the southeast portion of Acapulco. And again, the airport is a little bit off to the southeast. So here's the bay, Acapulco Bay, and then there's kind of that barrier island type of a feel just to the south of it, which would have been insane being out there in a rental car, probably a Hertz rental car out there in that sandbar out near the airport, maybe even a little bit south of there. You likely would have had a tsunami-like wall of water, especially once this flow turns around to the south on the backside of the hurricane. And then once it passes by Acapulco, that's when you got that onshore flow into the bay. And there is quite a lot of high terrain around the periphery of the bay. There's mountainous terrain here around Acapulco proper, but down here it's mostly barrier islands, very low-lying terrain, and you just had a relentless storm surge, onshore flow just pummeling that portion of the coastline. And I'm going to show you some of the scenes out there. This was it at peak intensity. This was Hurricane Otis that was approaching as a Category 5. There's Acapulco just to the northwest of it, and it reached a central minimum pressure of 923 millibars, max sustained winds of 165 miles an hour, and that caused it to surpass Hurricane Patricia as the strongest hurricane to ever make landfall on the Pacific coast of Mexico, and it more rapidly intensified than any other storm. And even though zoomed in, it looks like a pretty large meteorological phenomenon here. It was actually very compact, not too dissimilar from a Hurricane Charlie that made landfall a lot further north over the west coast of Florida. And a lot of times out here in the deep tropics, this time of year, later on in the fall, you'll get these small hurricanes like this, small tropical cyclones that are capable of intensifying much more rapidly. And you also had to realize there was a ton of very warm water at around 31 degrees Celsius just to the northwest of this storm. But the exact track of it definitely played a little bit of a trick on the models. The forecast track looped it back around and kept it over the relatively cool waters of about 27 to 28 degrees Celsius. That kept the intensity in check, especially with the wind shear. And the wind shear needs to be factored in a storm relative sense too. When you have a hurricane that's curling around and moving kind of against the southwesterly winds on the western edge of that Mexico high, that would have succumbed that storm to a lot more wind shear, and that coupled with relatively lower sea surface temperatures would have resulted in a much slower intensification. But instead it ended up kind of embedding inside that flow in the western periphery of the high, was moving along with the flow, so the storm relative wind shear dropped as it ejected off to the northwest, and it also moved over those very warm waters, allowing it to rapidly intensify. These are some scenes of damage that have been reported by media, and this is a big commercial building here. And I'm going to show you what this building looked like beforehand. This is likely the west-facing side of the building. So when you had those very powerful east to west winds, they were just hammering this portion of the building. If you were going to be riding this out, I would definitely get to the downwind side of it if you have to. Maybe even get in your vehicle, try to find a parking garage, get up in those floors in the parking garage and try to avoid the storm surge. One of the most dangerous parts of these urban hurricanes, like we learned, of course, during Hurricane Laura back in Lake Charles, is the flying projectiles that happen out here. And these buildings like this will lead to a lot of those projectiles. And this is what it looked like before. So you can see it was a very large commercial building. Obviously, these commercial buildings usually are very well built. And looking at some of the structures across Acapulco, it looks like some of the engineering out here is even better than what we see over portions of the Gulf Coast in the United States. A lot of those buildings are made of concrete, held up pretty well, but you can definitely see the classic tree shredding out there, the shredding of buildings that happens when a powerful hurricane enters into an urban area. You can see a lot of power outages out here as well. You can see the palm trees here completely shredded, likely by funneling between the buildings. You get a lot of that in the urban areas where the flow actually accelerates in between the buildings, and you get these little calm areas that will develop, and then you'll have winds that will even be stronger than what the hurricane is producing itself over the open ocean through the act of Bernoulli effect and the funneling in between some of these buildings. And that's why you'll see pockets of extreme damage out there, and other areas will look largely untainted. And you also get these large commercial buildings, which are largely made out of concrete. You can see, though, pockets of very severe damage, and that's why these are so dangerous in the urban areas. And even though you're seeing a lot of these large buildings, notice how they still have significant damage. So a lot of the smaller homes, a lot of the people that live along the coastline areas, they likely sustained a lot worse damage as well. And so in this video later on, I'm going to tell you too why this surprise happened, what the forecast models were showing. Very few ensemble members were showing this rapid intensification. I think there was one European model member that took it up over that warm water and rapidly intensified the hurricane. Really, all models kept it at a tropical storm or below, a relatively small storm that should have been torn to shreds by the wind shear. But once it started moving north and in a storm relative sense, that storm relative wind shear basically went to zero, and then it moved over that 31 degrees Celsius water. It created a recipe for disaster. And a lot of times it happens down here in the deep tropics off the Pacific coast of Mexico. A lot of times you get these smaller storms, especially during El Nino years. And we have a very powerful El Nino out there, an eastern tropical Pacific El Nino, as those warm waters develop over the eastern tropical Pacific, then overspread the rest of the tropical and even subtropical basin. So really those forecasts, you kind of need to hedge a little bit higher. When you factor in the climate system, when you have a El Nino, a lot of times these eastern Pacific hurricanes will intensify more rapidly. They have a little bit more heat energy to deal with. The Walker circulation is such that it actually favors tropical cyclones over the eastern tropical Pacific, whereas over the Atlantic basin during El Nino years, you usually get a lot more dry air, you get a lot more wind shear because of an accelerated Walker circulation in the Atlantic basin, and it's a little bit more unfavorable for convection and tropical cyclones in the Atlantic basin than it is over the eastern tropical Pacific when you get an El Nino conditions factored in. So with Hurricane Lydia, with Hurricane Otis, I think that it's good practice that during these El Nino years to kind of hedge a little bit higher in the intensity forecast, and also to keep an eye out for the potential for rapid intensification like what happened with Otis. basically over a 9-hour period, it went from a Category 1 to a Category 5 storm. And in less than 24 hours, the central pressure dropped over 77 millibars. It reminds me a little bit of Hurricane Wilma, which was in the Atlantic Basin. That was in 2005. But that eye got down to a 2 nautical mile wide eye, and the central pressure dropped below 900 millibars. This one was 923. Still very low pressure, classic Category 5 hurricane, making landfall with those 165 mile per hour winds. But you can see a lot of the shredding here, and these palm trees are meant to take a beating from these tropical cyclones. They have very flexible trunks, and so anytime you see these palm trees flattened like this, it's usually a sign that there were big time winds and a catastrophic hurricane. But you can still see some of the palm fronds remaining out here as well, and I think that's largely because as this hurricane approached from the southeast to the northwest, you had that offshore flow which was coming down the mountainous terrain, and that might have been just a bit of a saving grace for portions of Acapulco. But now near the airport and a little bit southeast of the airport, you didn't have that luxury. You had winds just ripping right off the ocean, causing mass problems. And you can see how dangerous this would be if you were seeking shelter in this room. You'd obviously have to be underneath this mattress to really have any chance. All the flying debris that will happen in there. Looks like this car might have been carried. Possibly this picture was from a storm surge prone area, maybe carrying those small vehicles in. I've also seen some videos more recently of flash flooding as that hurricane basically went inland, and it was almost as impressive as the rapid intensification was the rapid weakening as it moved inland and interacted with the mountainous terrain. It quickly weakened, but it also dumped all of its rainfall out there, and that led to flash flooding. So I've seen quite a bit of flash flooding out there as well across Acapulco, and that's as all that rain that's dumped over the mountainous terrain just inland of Acapulco is rushing toward the sea. So definitely a ton of flash flooding. You also had the storm surge flooding on approach. Here you can see Acapulco, and this image shows it intensifying to its near strongest point with a minimum pressure of 923 millibars, max sustained winds of 165. But this is what I mean, is it's approaching from the southeast. The front side of that hurricane largely has offshore flow, and I was looking at a lot of the webcams as this thing was approaching, and the winds weren't really consistent with Category 5 until it got a lot closer, but there was a lot less information further south, down near the airport, down along that barrier island, as well as down near San Andres, Playa, Escantada, a little bit further off to the southeast. Those areas were probably ground zero from this hurricane. And just on the north side, you can see those east to west winds that are coming in. Right as this thing was approaching that sandbar or near the Acapulco airport, you had that onshore flow, that tsunami-like wall of water with those rapid easterlies coming right off the Gulf. And in fact, probably even pinched by the landmass and the eye of the hurricane itself. So you likely had more of a boomerang effect of that tsunami-like wall of water. The good news, at least for Acapulco, is that this thing was approaching at an angle such that the storm surge wasn't maximized in the bay, Acapulco Bay itself. But still, there were likely a lot of those low-lying areas that were just ravaged by that storm surge. And this is the radar scope satellite data, which is really, well, I think I had like 10 frames of a loop. And you can see just how rapidly the cloud elements are just zipping around that eye. The eye structure itself didn't change a lot. You can see maybe some mesovortices inside, a lot of warming of the eye as well that happened with infrared. This band of clouds out here are penetrating high up into the troposphere, and that's why they're indicated at colder temperatures. But then the eye warms, and that's because you get subsidence in the middle of the eye. It'll clear out the eye right around the inside of that ring of very rapid convection. And whenever those eyes warm like that, you know that it's going to be very intense. And here you can see Acapulco proper. And the airport's down a little bit further south down here. There are some barrier islands right along that coastline. And then right here is San Andres, Playa, Encantada, right on the south end. And as this hurricane approached from the southeast, you can see that those big easterlies gusting up to 200 miles an hour approach this area, and it extends out a little bit as well into the ocean, into the Pacific Ocean. So you likely had a tsunami-like wall of water that coincided with that very intense eye wall, 200 mile per hour winds. I was looking at some of the structures down there, and there are a lot of weak structures, a lot of low-lying areas as well. Basically like a sandbar or a barrier island that you might see if you were chasing a hurricane. In Tampa, for example, this would be equivalent to Clearwater Beach area, or if you're out there chasing Hurricane Ian, Fort Myers Beach is real similar to this stretch right here, basically a very low-lying sandbar type of a feel. But initially you had offshore flow, so the storm surge wasn't that bad on approach, even though the winds were likely crazy out there. Not as strong as they would have been if they were whipping right off the ocean, but they were coming down off this mountainous terrain, so subsiding a little bit, even drying out. But once you got hit by this northern portion of the eye, right on the tip of San Andres, Playa Encantada there, you definitely had a wall of water that was probably 15 to 20 feet deep, potentially impacting the shoreline. I'm hoping that the shape of the shoreline might have deflected that storm surge a little bit out to sea to try to avoid that 20-foot wall of water coming in. But with a sandbar type of a feel out there, with the airport a little bit removed, there you can see the Bay of Acapulco. So if this thing was coming in at more of a 90-degree angle and came in just to the north of Acapulco, then you'd have pure onshore flow into the bay, and that would fill up the bay, and then a lot of those areas around its periphery would be flooded out, most definitely. And this was as I was monitoring this situation in real time. There you can see Acapulco with the star, the asterisk, and a lot of this flow is offshore on approach. But then once you got hit by those southeasterlies in the north side of the eye, and especially the shore parallel winds on the backside of the eye, you likely had that phenomena where some of the water got pulled out of these areas, and then once the hurricane goes by, the winds shift immediately onshore, and then you get that tsunami-like wall of water that comes in. But my biggest concern are if these southeasterlies on the north side of the eye kind of pinched off by the higher terrain to the north of it, some of the mountains as well off to the north, and the eye of the hurricane here. You get a little bit of a bubble in the ocean because of the very low pressure in the center of the hurricane. It leads the ocean surface to bubble up a little bit simply because of the low pressure of the hurricane. That contributes to about 25% of the storm surge, and the other 75% of the storm surge is from the physical piling up of the water against the coastline. But with this mountainous coastline right next to the very powerful hurricane, out to that point out there near San Andres, Playa Encantada, and I likely would have driven my rental car down here to try to scout out parking garages right on the tip of that, anticipating that storm surge. My goal as a hurricane chaser is to collect data out there to document the conditions as they're happening, and I probably would have tried to mount some storm surge sensors right on the point of that sandbar, anticipating that wall of water coming in, that tsunami-like wall of water. You can see a lot of this transverse banding as well, which is a pretty common feature of these very rapidly intensifying hurricanes. You can see some of these cold cloud tops in the outer bands, probably some water spouts that were coming on shore. And of course, you can see the dry eye in there with this water vapor imagery. But likely would have tried to drive out to the tip of that, but it would have been a very dangerous drive right along the coastline, along that barrier island right past the airport. The safe play would have been to stay in Acapulco proper and wait for the eye to come in. It did make landfall in the early morning hours. It was dark, of course, which also makes it a very dangerous place to chase. And here is some of that terrain south of the Acapulco airport. And this is why I compare this to like a Fort Myers Beach, for example, out there from Hurricane Ian that was just ravaged by about a 15-foot wall of water overspreading the whole community. There's the Pacific Ocean, of course. But down on this side of it, I'm going to show you some satellite image later. That is likely where the storm surge invaded initially from southeast to northwest, and then after the center of the hurricane passed, then you had that onshore flow, and all of that water went up and over this sandbar, right up into that intercoastal waterway. And so a lot of these structures likely were completely obliterated by that storm surge. Water has 1,000 times the density of the air. It's also moving very rapidly, and that can cause major problems. And this is a map that was put together by my good friend Jeff Petrowski, a veteran storm chaser. And this is up in Acapulco proper, a town of 1 million people. So a major urban area, major metropolitan area. And a lot of this terrain out here is mountainous too. So after the hurricane squeezed out all its moisture inland over interior Mexico, it dumped prolific amounts of rain, probably 15 inches of rain inland. And then you had life-threatening flash floods also causing loss of life and property, heading all the way toward this bay, likely turning the bay completely blue to brown as all that flash flooding came in. So you definitely had flooding from both directions. The only good news here in Acapulco is that a lot of the flow was offshore as this hurricane approached. And then it started to weaken as it began to interact with the mountainous terrain. And then once it went by and those winds shifted into a southwesterly direction, it's very possible that at the front of the hurricane, a lot of this water emptied out too. You probably had a decrease in the water content overall in Acapulco Bay. And then as the hurricane passed by and that flow shifted to onshore, it likely transported all of that inland. And these are in meters. You've got about a 6-foot elevation there. You've got about another 6-foot elevation there. It gets a little bit higher over the east side of the bay, up near about 15 feet in elevation. Likely a lot of these locations stayed mostly dry, at least a little bit away from the coastline, but it's very possible that some of these low-lying areas over the north side of the bay likely did not stay quite as favorable. And here is the map that I wanted to show you of Acapulco, and a lot of those damage images are still flooding in, but we still haven't seen anything from out near the airport. And you can see this large lagoon that's also a little bit inland. And so my biggest concern though is out here, and this is out near Barra Vieja as well, right on the southern tip, well removed from the airport. There's the airport right there, and a little bit further south. This is out near San Andres, Playa Encantada as well. You've got a river that comes down. Looks like possibly a dry river a bit there too, at least this time of year. But that could have been an issue too with some flooding. You probably had a river surge that likely whipped up that. But you can see that this point sticks out a little bit into the Pacific Ocean. And so my big concern is as that hurricane was approaching from the southeast and you had those big time southeasterly winds up into this direction, basically trapped between the higher terrain of Mexico and just offshore, the eye of the hurricane, just funneling that water up into that gap. I bet that there was some big time storm surge flooding out in this area, even on the north side of the hurricane when it was at peak intensity, making landfall with that minimum pressure down to about 923 millibars. And then when the hurricane passed by and those winds shifted to a southerly direction, you basically just had a wall of water come in and directly move over that populated sandbar. In fact, the airport, the international airport, is right in the middle of that location. So the whole airport likely sustained major storm surge. The elevation along this entire sandbar, anywhere south of the lagoon, is very low. You get into some higher terrain though up here near Acapulco proper, and at least that offshore flow had a chance to weaken by a lot of that wind, a lot of the surface roughness caused by the mountainous terrain. So you had a lot of sinking air. It was slowed down as well by the mountainous conditions just a little bit inland. But then once the hurricane went by and you had those winds unimpeded off the ocean, the good news, at least for Acapulco, is that the hurricane did weaken a little bit because of the interaction with land, but obviously still a Category 4 storm, likely Category 4 winds, funneled water right into the bay there of Acapulco. So definitely interesting terrain, and I want to zoom in a little bit on this, and then we can look and see what some of the conditions are out here a little bit south of the airport. There's Acapulco International Airport. It does look at least that the airport is elevated up about 5 to 6 feet. So if you were in the airport, you might have had a chance to stay a little bit dry, likely a lot of debris. It looks like some sheet metal as the roof there of the airport that's likely missing as well. You can see a couple hotels south of the airport, but north of the airport, it looks a lot more populated. You can see just north of the airport, likely some bigger structures, parking garages out there as well. The La Poza area, looks like there's a shopping village as well, just on the north side of the airport. But just on the south, and there's that lagoon as well, just inland. But you head a little bit south, and notice how the population looks like it gets a little bit more sparse. You get a lot less in the way of large buildings, a lot less in the way of those big commercial buildings. Looks like there's a golf course that probably doesn't exist anymore right on the Pacific coastline. You've likely got those big 5-star resorts that are along this area too, but it looks like you lose that a little bit the further south that you go. And you've also got these, look at the golf course right along the coast there. It's going to have some big problems too, some of these inland areas. But you can definitely see that the further south that you go, it looks a little bit less built up. And even this area down here, which is a more touristy area down near San Andres, Playa Encantada, down a little bit further south near Barra Vieja as well, it looks like you get a little bit more populated. The scary thing is that this is likely where the worst of the storm surge also came in. And then there's your big river, the Papagayo River, which is flowing into the Pacific Ocean there. That likely had a river surge that came into it. It's possible that this point out there absorbed a lot of the storm surge and maybe it was deflected a little bit out to sea. Storm surges behave, of course, like a fluid, and a lot of times they want to follow the path of least resistance. It's very possible you had those southeasterlies, and then maybe it was deflected just a little bit off. But likely then as the hurricane passed by and you started getting those winds shifting to a more southerly direction, all of these areas just got hammered by a big-time storm surge. And that point right there, that is where I would have wanted to ride out this hurricane in my rental car, maybe a little bit further west. I don't think I could have gone to the Mar y Rio. Certainly would have had big problems out there. I think that's, looks like a tourist attraction, but that's more for the river where the sea meets the ocean. Beach area out here. But yeah, this area was not survivable during the hurricane last night. Looks like a dirt road that'll take you out there. But then you start getting to the west of where this entrance is on the lagoon. Looks like you have some restaurants out here, but these are not the most well-built structures either further south. I mean, look at a lot of these roofs on here. These are going to be gone, just absolutely racked out there. No chance a lot of these survive, but it does seem like a lot of the structures over large swaths of Mexico are even better built than some of the structures that are along the Gulf Coast. And I think if you could have hung up on this road, you might have had a little bit of a better chance. I'd love to turn this into a terrain image. Here's the topography. Using Google Maps here. But yeah, it would have been dangerous out here. A lot of these areas probably are underwater with catastrophic damage out there. So that's likely where I would have intercepted. And now I want to talk a little bit about the surprise forecast that happened. And here's the official National Hurricane Center track. And Acapulco is just off to the northeast of it. I think Acapulco is like right up here. And that swath of very warm water was about over this area. Out over this area, you get a little bit greater than 31 degrees Celsius. And when the sea surface temperatures get down to around 27, 28 degrees Celsius, especially cooler than that, then a lot of times hurricanes will not be able to sustain or strengthen. But if they're up near 30, 29, 30, 31 degrees Celsius, definitely could be a candidate of rapid intensification, especially if there's not any wind shear. But the forecast models were showing this loop back around. And off to the northeast of the system, you had a high pressure that was a little bit further northeast than that. And around the high pressure, winds go clockwise. And so on the back side, you had your steering flow, which was south to north. And if this tropical cyclone is turning into that wind shear, the wind shear in a storm relative sense will get even more intense. And it also remains over relatively cooler sea surface temperatures of about 27 to 28 degrees C. And that will lead to a weakening tropical cyclone. But if any of those models take this off to the north and move it along with those upper level winds that are south to north, in a storm relative sense, it's possible to get that wind shear down to zero. And with a compact storm moving over that very warm water just to the north of it, that is when it underwent rapid intensification. And so even though a lot of those forecast models were not showing any intensification, a majority of these members did that little loop and kept it over the relatively cool waters. So this is the borderline of a Category 1 hurricane, and these are the different forecast models here that in terms of intensity that kept it below a Category 1 hurricane. And this thing intensified from a Cat 1 to a Category 5 in less than 9 hours, dropping 77 millibars, going from a tropical depression to a Category 5 hurricane in about a 24-hour period. And here's the actual intensification that it did all the way up to 165 mile an hour storm. So what a discrepancy. This has happened before. And in fact, I think it was with Otis in 2017. A great meteorologist, Tomer Berg, who does some incredible visualizations for these hurricanes, found that piece of information. But all of these forecast models did a similar loop like this in terms of the hurricane kind of curling into that cooler water. And there's a little bit of a patch of some much warmer water, likely consistent with El Nino. I'm not saying it's 100% due to El Nino, but at least indirectly related to El Nino. And here were those sea surface temperatures. There you can see the track of the hurricane, and you can see the green. These are the cooler temperatures, and a lot of that forecast track bent this thing back around and kept it over the cooler sea surface temperatures, and that's why a majority of those members didn't show that rapid intensification. But once it got picked up on that western periphery of the high and began to accelerate off to the northwest, moving along with that upper level flow, the storm relative wind shear dropped significantly, and then it moved over this water that is very warm. You can see that the red is greater than 31 degrees Celsius, incredibly high sea surface temperatures, and then it made landfall as a Category 5 storm. I should have been looking at this a lot more deeply, but it requires a very compact storm as well. Basically the size of basically a large supercell storm. There's probably not too much difference in scale between the El Reno, Oklahoma supercell of 2013 and a hurricane this compact. And when it moves over that very warm water, it just feeds off of that heat energy. Hurricanes are also a very important part of this planet, transporting heat from the Earth's surface up to aloft and from the equatorial regions up to the poles. If we didn't have hurricanes or didn't have supercell storms or tornadoes and MCSs or mesoscale convective systems, we'd likely have bigger problems out there because we just wouldn't be able to maintain very much balance. Here is a trough that's moving through the southwest U.S. If this hurricane was up near Baja, it would be feeling big time upper level wind shear. So Norma was probably the last hurricane up here for the Baja Peninsula, as it looks like the polar front jet stream and the subtropical jet working in tandem are bringing a lot of wind shear that far south. But Otis was in the deep tropics way down here. A lot of warm water obviously in that isolated area. El Nino off to the south, but the eastern tropical Pacific always goes nuts when you get these El Nino conditions. This is the upper level steering pattern. We're looking in the upper troposphere, and here is your Mexico high centered over the western Gulf of Mexico. Flow around this is in a clockwise direction, so you had a lot of that southerly steering current on the west side of that high. And basically, if this thing got lost down here on the southwestern quadrant of the high and was able to meander in this direction, feeling a little bit of that southerly flow, but not really turning to the north, instead turning into that wind shear, that would cause this to be a lot weaker. But you look at the upper level pattern, and it sure looks like this thing is going to get picked up and get transported off to the northwest and move into that region of very warm water. And when it starts to move along with that upper tropospheric flow, you got to look at wind shear in a storm relative sense, and a lot of that wind shear dropped to zero as it approached the west coast of Mexico, rapidly intensifying as it moved in. I've been looking at some of the long range models, and there is some indication that maybe the Caribbean Sea could get active again. Might be kind of a Central American gyre here that could potentially lead to the formation of another tropical cyclone as we go into early November. It's not unprecedented. You may remember during those 3 active years, we had Hurricane Zeta that came in during late November, and that was forecast to be a Cat 1, I think, at landfall. Then they upped it to a Cat 2, and then it finally made landfall as a Category 3 storm in the central Gulf Coast, and we were out near Venice, out in the far southeastern quadrant. Damn telemarketers, out of the far southeastern portion of Louisiana, way out in the sea there. And our goal was to document 100% the storm surge out of the far southeastern portion of Louisiana. And then Hurricane Zeta ended up coming in a lot further to the west. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is due to El Nino too, the rapid intensification that happened. And I'll show you some of these Pacific Ocean sea surface temperature anomalies out there right now that can show you El Nino. It's just cranking right away. And a lot of times during El Nino, you'll get that little belt of cooler water in the subtropics. That's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation horseshoe. This right here is the subtropical branch of the PDO. This is the extratropical branch of the PDO, and it's a horseshoe that basically faces off to the west. And it wraps around warmer sea surface temperatures in the middle. This is the North Pacific Oscillation here, which is starting to moderate. You don't have quite the warm water in the NPO that you had during this past storm season. That's why I think we're getting a little bit less of that tendency for a trough ridge pattern across the United States. But down here is the raging Eastern Pacific El Nino. And this forms as you get a relaxation and upwelling, a relaxation of the easterly trade wind, so you get a lot less upwelling in the Eastern Pacific. And then those warm anomalies as you're not bringing up that cool water from deep down into the ocean overspread, as you still have easterlies, of course. You still have easterly trade winds, even though they're a little bit weaker. And then eventually, as this El Nino matures, you're going to get a re-intensification of the trade winds probably into 2024, and you'll start to get a reinvigoration of the upwelling. You'll get cooler anomalies or neutral anomalies that'll start to appear in the eastern tropical Pacific, and then that'll concentrate a lot of those warm anomalies into the central Pacific, which still impacts the subtropical jet. You still get an energized subtropical jet over southern portions of North America. But where this hurricane happened, you can see a little bit of cool water there. That's actually associated with the previous 3 years of La Nina, basically this subtropical branch of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. You can see how you get a couple more cool pockets of that water, but around that you get a lot warmer water north and to the south of it, kind of associated on the north side of that eastern tropical Pacific El Nino. And of course the impacts of the Walker circulation you also have to take into account. I'll show you what the Walker circulation looks like here. Those are neutral conditions. We'll go over neutral conditions first on the Walker circulation. So basically what happens over the Pacific, you have these easterly trade winds, of course, and these are neutral conditions. It's a little bit warmer in the western tropical Pacific, so it's a lot healthier out there for convection. That's why you get a lot of those super typhoons out over the western Pacific. And during a warm phase western Pacific oscillation, or WPO, you get even more of those out there. And over the eastern tropical Pacific, it's a lot cooler in terms of the sea surface temperatures. You have the California current that's heading on the south side of the western edge of North America. And in general, that leads to relative subsidence in the eastern Pacific, tropical Pacific, and rising motion over the western tropical Pacific, just because you have warmer temperatures out there. Sometimes these MJO or convective bursts will be born out of these convective bursts in the western Pacific oscillation, and then they'll propagate around the tropical and subtropical belt of the globe, leading to upticks in convection, even if you don't have overall favorable conditions. During La Ninas, you get an intensification of these trade winds. You get more subsidence over the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. You get cooler sea surface temperatures out there, and you get a more unfavorable condition for convection and for hurricanes. But during El Ninos, you get weaker than usual trade winds. So these easterlies at the low levels will slow down. It also slows down the winds at the upper levels, and also mitigates the subsidence that you get over the eastern tropical Pacific. So on a larger time scale, it actually becomes more favorable for convection and more favorable for tropical cyclones over the eastern tropical Pacific. During El Ninos, though, it has an impact on the tropical Pacific in that you also get a stronger Walker circulation on this side of it because of the stronger subsidence that you get, and that actually accelerates. And you actually will get, the opposite is true during El Ninos. You get the rising motion, and you get actually subsiding air across the Atlantic Basin. A little bit more wind shear too across the Atlantic Basin. That's why we had those very warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, portions of the Caribbean, up and down the Atlantic as well. And that's because of El Nino. You get a lot of that sinking air out over the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. This is anomalously sinking air, and that leads to a lot less cloud cover, a lot less air mass thunderstorms that you usually get during the summer, and that led to some of these sea surface temperatures just going nuts out there. I saw a couple of those down near the Florida Keys, like out near triple digits even. But I think it's a conflict of interest with hurricanes out there, and you get those really warm sea surface temperatures. You still need favorable atmospheric conditions for lift, and when you get that general subsidence across the Atlantic Basin and a lot of wind shear, a lot of times those hurricanes don't really reach their ceiling or their true potential. A lot of times too, they'll recurve out to sea, and that's really why we kind of saw a reduction in the hurricane intensity and also the landfalls that happen across the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico coastline. Whereas the opposite is true over the eastern tropical Pacific underneath those warm water, and this is in an anomalous sense. So you just get anomalous conditions that really favor convection over the eastern tropical Pacific. And then the opposite is true with La Nina, where we had 3 years of this crap up until 2020. And really, I think the atmospheric conditions in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico probably got started about 2017 when we saw that major uptick in hurricanes, including in 2020, 6 hurricane landfalls in the Gulf of Mexico alone. La Ninas, though, are a lot less favorable here in the tropical Pacific and for those hurricanes making landfall in Mexico. I knew that there was going to be an El Nino. Obviously knew there was an El Nino. I studied this in grad school, sea surface temperature patterns and their impact downstream on North American climate. I follow the PDO, the NPO very closely, sea surface temperatures. That's just kind of what I worked on in my 17 years at the University of Oklahoma when I was storm chasing so much. So I'm obviously looking for those types of conditions out there, and definitely should have been aware of the hurricane situation in Acapulco and just terrible damage out in Mexico, sadly, from this hurricane down near Acapulco, and especially down south portions of the airport. I saw that the authorities, the military was on their way down to Acapulco to help anybody in need out there, of course. And thank you, Team Dominator members, too, for tuning in to this live update. I usually do these to Team Dominator members. I usually do these live updates for Team Dominator members on here, but this one was so important and such an unusual event that I figure I would do this for everybody on this one. And such an unprecedented event coming out to that west coast of Mexico there, a lot of warm water. But I think that a lot of the reason why the models didn't pick up on that rapid intensification are because of the forecast track and it kind of curving off a little bit to the left and keeping it over that cooler water. I'm pretty sure that that is why a lot of these models didn't show rapid intensification. I think that if some of those tracks took it right up over that warm water, moving along with that southerly upper level flow and in a storm relative sense, then you'd basically that wind shear would largely go to zero. Interesting. There's the satellite imagery, and I was obviously watching the satellite imagery just in awe. We need a lot more flights out there too, probably hurricane hunter data, because the models can only do so well, but when the hurricane hunters are flying these storms and initializing those models of that very important data that they collect inside of the storm, it can lead to just a little bit of a difference. And if a couple of those ensemble members are showing rapid intensification, then I bet that they would have picked up on that forecast. But you can see the timing up here. I mean, this thing is still supposed to be out to sea here, basically screeching to a halt, not really getting picked up by those southerly winds on the west side of the Mexico High. If some of those models showed that and it got picked up by those southerlies, the storm relative wind shear would have gone to zero, and then it would have moved over that very warm water in the eastern tropical Pacific and likely would have continued to intensify. Here's the sea surface temperatures again with that forecast track moving right over the very warm water. In red there, the red, this is 31 degrees C. So basically the rapid intensification started right when it began to eject off to the northwest and moved over that high oceanic heat content. That little bubble of cooler sea surface temperature is likely related to the cold phase subtropical branch of the PDO there. Probably duped, caused a bit of a head fake to the models that curled it around and kind of kept it over that cool ocean current. But this is a little bit more due to El Nino. So when you zoom out and you view these El Ninos, you just see that big belt of very warm water. But when you zoom in like this, you can see complexities. Pockets of very warm water, pockets of cool water, pockets of very warm water. These are likely Kelvin waves too that are trapped by the eastern boundary condition that is the terrain. And that's largely too how these El Ninos and La Ninas will spread their sea surface temperature anomalies near the surface along the eastern periphery of the Pacific Ocean basin. And these are probably like little miniature Kelvin waves here of warm water, opposite in sign. You can basically imagine kind of a wave-like pattern propagating from south to north, trapped right along the boundary condition. So this is definitely kind of mesoscale oceanic meteorology here, where you had this area of very warm sea surface temperatures just to the northwest of the hurricane. But if it would have remained over the cooler sea surface temperatures, probably wouldn't have been quite as bad. But never stop chasing, that's my motto. Definitely should have lived up to that. I was kind of trying to get some rest during this quiet period because we've been chasing the whole entire 2023 season, January, February, crazy tornado season, Hurricane Idalia, post-tropical cyclone Lee up in Nova Scotia, and then I kind of botched the Mexico season due to the eastern tropical Pacific. Now look at this satellite imagery. And zooming out, you can see how small this storm is. We'll draw a little bit of a donut, and that thing is just barely sitting over deep South Texas. If it came in south of Corpus Christi, you probably would have had just an isolated area of the coast getting those very bad impacts. But when you zoom out, you can really see how compact that hurricane is, and that definitely played a role too in its rapid intensification. If this was a larger storm, then it would have taken much longer to respond to those sea surface temperatures, and it probably would not have rapidly intensified as it moved over the western edge of the periphery of that high. Now look at that thing go. Quite a record breaker in terms of the meteorology. Popping back over to the chat here. Cold 44 degrees and light rain in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. Angie Hilburn, hi Team Dominator members. Viv on here as well. I understand, Maggie. I don't catch every hurricane, but I easily could have been down there for this one, and I kind of wanted an adventure anyway. I've always wanted to go to this portion of the Mexico coastline too, down near Acapulco. My Uncle Bruce spent a lot of time down there, probably a little bit too much time, back in the 80s and 90s. But it's a beautiful area down there, and your heart definitely goes out for the people of Acapulco. They didn't have very much in the way of warning because of this forecast, but it's also not the fault of the meteorologists. You know, we're kind of at the mercy of the models that we use as well. But if I would have taken and given this a deeper dive, I think that I possibly could have figured it out and seen that warm blob off to the north, and I was really hungry for a trip down there to western Mexico. Could have live streamed it, of course, for everybody. That's right, Bill. It's never been more important to never stop chasing than now. Yeah, I was thinking about going to Minnesota to catch the snowstorm as well, Shannon. And I was also considering going to the Southern Plains to work the flooding. There is a moderate risk for flooding out there. And I can show this to you on the Western, or the Weather Prediction Center. And I believe that a lot of this is some remnants of Norma. But there you can see the moderate risk. And this isn't for severe weather, but it is for excessive rainfall and flash flooding. Moving into southern Oklahoma later this evening. There's a main convective band just to the west of the DFW Metroplex, and those are starting to train over the same areas. And definitely looks like there could be some pretty significant flooding setting up for portions of northwest Texas. I do think that a lot of it's probably going to remain just a little bit west of the DFW area. If you look at some of the models here, let's see what the latest HRRR model is pumping out for precip. And you've got a big front coming to the south. And that's where that winter storm is going to be happening. 10-15 inches of snow, eastern Montana, portions of western North Dakota. Even Bismarck's going to get in on the action. And we'll take a look at the 18Z HRRR and see what the updates are for rainfall down in the southern plains. See over the next 24 hours. And there it is. It looks like the HRRR fluffs out this main band to the west of DFW. You get about 4 to 5 inches of rain into southern Oklahoma, and then it develops a new convective band into central Texas, down near Waco, Corsicana area, Brownwood. And right now, the 18Z HRRR brings that just to the south of the DFW Metroplex. And if that happens, then a lot of the DFW area would remain free of those dangerous, impactful flooding conditions. But it looks like areas just to the south of the DFW Metroplex could get hammered. We'll head on over to our trusted 3-kilometer NAM. It seems to just dominate that band across North Texas. You can see what some of the conditions are doing out there. Still have that flash flood warning on the north side of Dallas, but there's your convective band, and this is the band that the 3-kilometer NAM thinks is just going to dominate. You can see it's just to the west of DFW, training over the same areas too. If you loop this, It is advancing eastward with time, so it looks like portions of this band are probably going to push east over Fort Worth and Dallas. Boy, it looks like a very small shower has reinvigorated that flash flood warning, that advisory just to the northwest of Flower Mound. And what the HRRR thinks is going to happen is the southern portion of this band, a little bit further south, is going to start dominating and then slide south of the DFW Metroplex. But boy, it looks like based on the latest trends, I don't really see that happening as much. See what's going on up into Oklahoma. A lot of that heavier rain starting to move into south central Oklahoma, just to the west of Ardmore. You can see some of these convective elements out here. Almost looking a bit like a QLCS, but these are all just classic rainmakers. Classic El Nino pattern with that closed upper level low getting choked off over the southwest. And you just get a lot of moisture. Eventually, this is going to pivot more toward ice storms as we go later on in the fall and into the winter. You'll get an energized subtropical jet. You'll get these cold air mass intrusions like what we're getting. But yeah, there are some mesoscale discussions too. Heavy thunderstorms drift east, eventually toward DFW. There's Austin, San Antone. Mesoscale discussion. Axis of heavy thunderstorms drifts east today. Rainfall of 2 to 5 inches should cause scattered flash flooding through this afternoon. Upper level low over northwest Mexico. It's basically closing off a little bit prematurely because of the energized subtropical jet. These split flow patterns are pretty common with El Nino. Later on, activity will expand over the more vulnerable I-35 corridor, expecting future need for MPDs. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this live update. Just to recap again, terrible scenes of damage throughout Acapulco area. As this Category 5 hurricane made landfall, it went from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in less than 9 hours. 77 millibar pressure drop in less than 24 hours. That's a bomb cyclone if I've ever seen one, times 5. And big time meteorological event. A lot of the damage to the commercial buildings are what we've seen so far in Acapulco proper. But we do think that a little bit further south, things could even be worse. Down near the airport, which is closed, of course, due to big-time damages. And I wouldn't be surprised if the airport is completely shredded or underwater, just because of how prone that area is to storm surge, to big winds as well. And just a remarkable hurricane. Definitely modulated a bit by the El Nino conditions in the eastern tropical Pacific, certainly. Maybe even a little bit with La Nina, 3 years of La Nina, as you have those little scattered little bumps left over of some cooler sea surface temperatures associated with the subtropical branch of the PDO. But really, you got to take a deeper dive and see those smaller scale Kelvin waves of higher and alternating higher and lower SSTs propagating northward right along the eastern periphery of the ocean basin there on the Pacific coastline of Mexico. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into this recap. We did break down some of the sea surface temperatures out there. That wasn't the only variable that played a role in its rapid intensification, but also it being a relatively small tropical cyclone allowed it to rapidly intensify over this 31 degrees Celsius water. And also it moving along with that flow on the western periphery of the Mexico high in a storm relative sense. Once this started to move off to the north toward Acapulco, that's when the wind shear also subsided a lot more. But a lot of times you'll get these Kelvin waves, and this oceanic Kelvin waves that'll happen, alternating in sign. Warm water, slightly cooler sea surface temperature anomalies, and then warmer water there. These are raw SSTs, so don't want to say that those are anomalies at all. So hopefully everybody's okay. Search and rescue process continues out there. And just wanted to say thank you, Team Dominator members, for subscribing. We're going to be ramping up the content this winter and into early next year. We have a lot of big plans for extreme weather visualization. We're also trying to publish our rocket paper still 4 years later. Just finished that last round of revisions today. I'm also working on my second book too, so that should be interesting. That'll probably come out next year maybe as well. Need to get a haircut here at some point. And we're working on a new Team Dominator headquarters too out in Oklahoma. And we also want to build a new Dominator 4. But first, we've got to get Dominator 1, 2, and 3 back out in the field. Get them fixed up, intercepting tornadoes. I want to revamp our science mission once again. Self-funded science. A lot of times, your savings will go to zero because self-funded, it's impossible basically to profit off of science. It's just something that you do because you're passionate about it and because you love it and because you want to make a difference. And so, but I do want to figure out a way to get our science mission going again, including launching rockets into tornadoes, miniaturized sensors, and more out there. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Really appreciate everybody. And we're going to be activating live storm chase mode again here very soon. Brian has also been making a lot of upgrades on the live streaming end of things. And so thank you everybody for tuning in to this update, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Never stop chasing.